Well, welcome and good morning. I am so thankful for this opportunity that we have to study a topic that I am very passionate about, and that is the evidence for the resurrection. The reason why I'm passionate about this subject happened a few years ago. I was in college, and I had a friend named Lance West, and he was a new convert, and he was really struggling with his faith. So I decided I would ask him to lunch, and we met at the Memorial Student Center at Texas A&M, and I sat across from him, and I was just asking him questions about his faith. After a few questions, he turned the questions on me and asked, "What evidence do you have outside of the Bible for Jesus existing, the resurrection happening, or the inspiration of Scripture?" And I looked at him. I didn't have anything for him. In that moment, my heart just sank. My stomach just left me, and I didn't have anything for him. Fortunately, he was very patient with me, and he let me and him study this over time and come to a conclusion. But from that moment on, I became very passionate about evidence and evidence for the resurrection. So the first question this morning that I'll ask is, why study the evidence for the resurrection? That's reason number one, is to help people that are struggling with their faith or outside the faith. We sing a song on occasion, number 353, "He Lives." And I apologize if you like this song, because I'm just going to crucify it for a moment. The end of the song, the end of the chorus says, "You ask me how I know he lives within my heart." And that statement is true in many ways. He lives within my heart is justification for how we know he lives. But I would like to see how far this goes in a conversation with a skeptic. Because the truth is that many different religions have religious experiences. You talk to Muslims, pantheists, Hindus, even Mormons will say that their God or gods live in their heart. What I feel like we are different than those religions is we have evidence for our faith. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is that the resurrection in particular is critical to our faith. If you're in 1 Corinthians 15, I would just drop a marker right in there. We're going to come back to this passage many times. I'm going to go ahead and read verse 17 now. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 17. "And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, and you are still in your sins." Paul says that this fact, that the resurrection happened, is the point that is critical to their faith. Otherwise, it's useless. Otherwise, why are we here? Imagine a world, a terrible world, in which Jesus did not rise from the dead. What do we have? What would we have? Well, we would know for sure that Jesus was not the Son of God, and we could not trust anything that he said about forgiveness of sins, about salvation in the end, about how to live. He would just be a pitiable martyr, just like many before him and many after him. We couldn't trust him. But imagine now that he was resurrected. It'd be God's stamp of approval that he was the Son of God, and we can have absolute trust in every word that he said. Absolute trust in Jesus. So that's why we are studying the evidence for the resurrection. We're going to go about it by proving that 4 facts are indeed historical, and we'll back these up with evidence from history, from the Bible, and from logic. The first fact is that Jesus existed and was crucified. Number 2, Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Number 3, Jesus' tomb was found empty. And number 4, and probably most importantly, people firmly believed that Jesus was raised even if they were predisposed or biased to the contrary. And at the end, I'll ask this: what is the best explanation of these 4 facts? And this is a good opportunity to note a couple things. This lesson is not a replacement of faith. What I'm giving here is evidence for our beliefs, but not proof, and there's a difference. Proof is absolute. Proof is a smoking gun. Proof is what Thomas had when he physically felt the holes in Jesus' hands. And unfortunate for us, Thomas didn't record that event on his iPhone and send that to us. What we have, though, is a mountain of evidence to study. And it is indeed a mountain. We won't have time to get to all the different things that could be brought up. And note number 2, I owe much of this lesson it's material from Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Gary Habermas, who I believe are the leading scholars surrounding the resurrection today. And if you want more information, I can send you some links, some great free material if you'd like to study these more fully. Well, let's dive in. Fact number 1, Jesus existed and was crucified. Why is this important to a topic of the resurrection? Well, we must prove that he died before we could prove that he lived after he died. For example, I could say that I was resurrected a few days ago, and you would say, Trey, I don't know if you did the dying thing first. You know, you've got to die first before you're resurrected. So we'll prove this. First, it's verified by early and independent biblical sources. And you might say, Trey, didn't you just say you're going to show us things outside of the Bible? But I would say that even skeptics and critics will accept that what we have here is a historical document. They don't necessarily believe that it is true or definitely not inspired. A lot of skeptics will not believe that it's inspired, but they will believe that at least most of it is written by the people that we think it's written by and when we think it was written in the 1st century. For example, if you look at Luke chapter 1, just one of the 4 accounts of Jesus' life, Luke doesn't start off his gospel by saying, once upon a time in a faraway place, there lived a man named Jesus. But he starts it like this. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word having delivered to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So we see that this is a historical account. And Luke in particular, in Luke and in Acts, which is most likely written by him, he records lots of historical details that makes this a historical narrative. So we can be sure, at the very least, that Jesus existed and was crucified. But if we were to just throw out the Gospels and throw out the rest of the New Testament, we could be sure of this fact just from early and independent, outside or extra-biblical sources. We'll dive into 3 of my favorites. Number 1, I'm sorry for the small font. Number 1 is from Tacitus in the Annals of Imperial Rome, written about 116 AD. Tacitus was a Roman historian born in the 1st century. He wrote in the 2nd century about the Roman emperors. And I'll read this. This is written about the reign of Nero in 64 AD. Something special happened in 64, the Great Fires of Rome, in which Nero put guilt on Christians for setting fire to the city that burned 6 days and burned essentially the whole city down. I'll read this now. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, which is most likely Jesus Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, this checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of a crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. So a couple things to point out about this. It's obvious that Tacitus does not like Christians. This isn't a man who's trying to skew history inside of Christians. He is clearly against them. So we can believe that this is a true account. He believed this was historical fact. He also verifies something we see in the Gospels, is that it was under the reign of Pontius Pilate that the crucifixion happens. This puts the timestamp for Jesus' death to be exactly when we read it in Scripture, a very small window in which Pontius Pilate lived and reigned in Judea. Number two, from Suetonius, another Roman scholar historian, in Life of Claudius and Lives of the 12 Caesars, written in 121 AD. This is a passage that is taken from the reign of Claudius in the 40s and 50s AD, just a few years after Christ. He says, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. So again, Suetonius believes that Jesus is a historical figure. He actually existed. And a couple things to note here is that he confuses Jews and Christians, which is very common in especially the first century. A lot of Romans didn't know how to treat the different groups and kind of viewed one as a sect of the other. But also, we see this earmarked actually in Acts. We see this kind of follow the Acts narrative. If you're familiar with Acts chapter 18, I'm just going to go ahead and turn there. It's not on the slides, but Acts chapter 18, verse 2. Speaking of Paul's travels, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome, and he went to see them. So this is verified in Luke's account. This is indeed history that Luke was writing. And then finally, from Lucian of Samosata, in the passing of Peregrinus in 170 AD, this is a very different sort of document here. Lucian was not a historian, he was a comedian. He wrote satires in the 2nd century and was very popular for them. He loved to make fun of anything that was supernatural or, in his opinion, superstitious. The Passing of Peregrinus is a satire written about a man, Peregrinus, who takes advantage of Christians. He just goes around and takes advantage of Christians' generosity. And this is what he wrote. The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains their contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they all be brothers, from the moment that they were converted, and deny the gods of Greece, and worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property. This is a fascinating read because it kind of shows how 2nd century Christians lived. But I just want to point out that Lucian and his audience viewed Jesus and his crucifixion as historical facts. Facts to make fun of, but facts indeed. So we can know that Jesus existed and was crucified. Fact number 2 is that Jesus was buried and in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And why is this important? Well, we have to show that he was buried before we could show that he rose again. And this is verified by early Christian tradition. It's not just a legend that he was buried in the tomb. Let's look again at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I'll read verses 3 through 5 again. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. So what's interesting about this passage is that most scholars believe that what he's writing here is an early Christian creed or motto. Paul says that he delivered to them what he received. And then he repeats these lines that are distinctly non-Pauline. They don't carry the same sort of literary structure that Paul typically writes. It is most likely that this was something that was repeated often by early Christians and that Paul got himself and delivered to the First Corinthian church. So we know that this is something that was spoken of in the early first century. First Corinthians was written in most likely 55 AD. And most scholars would put this creed as written between 3 and 5 years of Jesus dying and being resurrected. So we know for sure that his burial and other facts from this passage aren't just legends that were cooked up 100 years later. These are something that was believed by people in the first century around Judea. But also we know that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea because all 4 Gospels point to this fact. If you're familiar with the Gospels, you know that they were written by different perspectives. Some of them have certain stories, some of them have different stories. Even when they write about the same thing, they often bring in different details. But what's fascinating about all the 4 Gospels is that particularly about the burial account, they're almost exactly the same. They bring out the same details. Even John, who's typically written in a very different perspective than the other 3. So we won't read these, but they are very similar. What I want to point out is one detail in particular, that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And why I wanted to bring that up is because Christians would not likely invent a Sanhedrin member burying Jesus. Joseph was a member of the Sanhedrin, as was Nicodemus. And if you know the Gospels, you know that the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin were the bad guys. They're the bad guys in all the different stories. And the Sanhedrin was responsible for killing Jesus. They essentially threw their political weight around with the Romans to get Jesus crucified. So if someone were to invent the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, why would they paint the bad guys in a good light? Why would they hold up Joseph of Arimathea as a righteous man who was just part of the Sanhedrin that killed Jesus? It's very unlikely that they would invent this part of the story. And that's why we can be assured that Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Fact number 3 is that Jesus' tomb was found empty. And we know this because the tomb location was well known. Just building off of the last fact that he was buried in a particular tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, we know that anybody who questioned the resurrection would have just walked over to the tomb and saw if he was there. So imagine if you were a Roman official or Jewish official in the first century, and you started to hear these rumors circulating around that Jesus, that the body was not in the tomb and Jesus was raised. What would you do? You would just walk the quarter mile over to Joseph of Arimathea's tomb and see for yourself. I'm just imagining here, that tomb got a lot of foot traffic a few weeks after these rumors started circulating. I would say that there's a 0% chance that the idea of the resurrection would have ever happened in Judea if there was a body in the tomb. There's just no chance. That's how we know the tomb is empty. And also, we know what the Jews were saying about the tomb. Matthew records kind of the back room discussion where the Jews are kind of thinking, what do we do about this body being missing? What do we do about this idea about the resurrection? Matthew 28, verses 11 through 15. I'll go ahead and read that. Matthew 28, 11 through 15. While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priest all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if it comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. There was not a good other explanation, and by admitting that the disciples stole the body, they're indirectly admitting that the tomb was indeed empty. Jews in the following few centuries, there wasn't another solution proposed. It would always came back to this story that the disciples stole the body. That's again how we have assurance that Jesus' tomb was empty. And then finally, we know the tomb was empty because Christians would not likely invent that women were the first to discover the empty tomb. This was recorded in John. Christians would not invent this because at the time, women's testimony was not viewed as reliable. And this is testified in many different documents, but I'll just highlight a couple. Josephus in Antiquity of the Jews in AD 93-94 says, but let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex, nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on account of the ignobility of their soul, since it is probable that they may not speak truth, either of hope of gain or fear of punishment. So he says the testimony of women should not be permitted in a court of law. And the Talmud, which is a collection of rabbinic teachings in 200 AD, says this: any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Also, they are not valid to offer. This is equivalent to saying that one who is rabbinically accounted a robber is qualified to give the same evidence as a woman. These are not very nice words written about women's testimony. They were not celebrating International Women's Day at this time. And for hundreds of years, the testimony of women was not allowed in court, especially in Jewish courts. So would a disciple who's making up a gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, would they just invent that women were the first witnesses to the empty tomb? It is very unlikely. In fact, the disciples may have even viewed this as an inconvenient fact of the resurrection story that women were the first to discover this. That's how we know the tomb is empty. And finally, fact number 4. Now, if I've lost your attention, please come back, because this is probably the most important point here. People firmly believe that Jesus was raised, even if they were predisposed or biased to the contrary. We know this for several reasons, because Jesus seemed to appear to multiple groups at different times. In 1 Corinthians, let's read that again. 1 Corinthians, I'll read verses 5 through 9. And that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as of one untimely born, he appeared also to me. If you contrast this with other religions like Islam or Mormonism, different groups had a divine experience, and that group was typically together at the same time, and it only happened once, maybe twice. In the case of the gospel, in 1 Corinthians, it talks about several different groups receiving this appearance. They all agreed on the same thing, that he was bodily resurrected. And also, one of these groups was greater than 500 people. It's almost impossible for a group of more than 500 people to hallucinate together and come to this exact same conclusion. All it would take is one person to be like, no, you're all wrong. I don't know what you're seeing, but I'm not seeing it. it would only take one person to just invalidate the entire experience for everyone else. It would have to take something extraordinary for all these different groups of people to believe the exact same thing. Also, we read that most Jews had no expectation of the Messiah dying and rising again. Today, we are very familiar with the idea of the resurrection, the resurrected hero. We read about it in fiction novels, in just about every other Marvel movie, it seems, has something to do with resurrection in it. But Jews at the time did not see this really as a possibility, that the Messiah would die and then rise again. They would have passages in their mind when thinking of Jesus, if they believed in him, like Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, something that I believe is clearly messianic, and they would view as well as messianic. I'll read Isaiah 9, 6 and 7. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful God, or Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So even though Jesus said several times that he was going to die and that he would be resurrected, Jews were ingrained with this idea that the Messiah would come, set up an earthly kingdom, and it would continue forevermore. This is what they were expecting. So it would be such a disappointment for them to see their Messiah, who they believed in and trusted in, to die on a cross. Because they would think about these passages, and where is the cross in 6 and 7? Where is the cross and where is the resurrection? It says that of his increase and of peace there will be no end. Well, what? I mean, he died. And it will continue from this time forth and forevermore. It'd be a huge slap in the face. They would think perhaps that the only thing that they could do is try to hide themselves and prevent themselves from dying, because all hope was lost. It is very unlikely that they would invent this story and go about spreading it unless something truly incredible happened after his death. And then finally, and probably my favorite, we read that he appeared to James, Jesus' brother. So again in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, we read that then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Most likely here, this is James, the younger brother of Jesus, or the second oldest. James is a very interesting character in the Gospels, because we read in like Matthew and John that Jesus' siblings didn't accept that he was the Messiah. In fact, there's some indication to believe that they thought he was maybe crazy and that he should stop preaching what he was preaching. But at the same time, we read in history and in the Bible that he became one of the most prominent leaders in Judea, around Jerusalem. So what happened? What's fascinating also about this is that it's earmarked by history. We have a passage about James, the brother of Jesus, from Josephus. So again, this is Josephus, Antiquity of the Jews, written in probably 94, 95 AD. He says, Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he, this is someone who assumed to the position of high priest, assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when they had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So we read in history that James, the brother of Jesus, was martyred because of his beliefs. And this is just incredible evidence here. Because most of us have brothers, right? Most of us in this room have a brother. One of my brothers is here today. What would it take for Nathan to believe that I was the Son of God? What would it take? Well, it'd take a miracle. And maybe more than that. It'd take something truly spectacular for him to come to that belief, because as he'll tell you, he changed my diaper. I mean, he knew my weaknesses growing up. He knew my strengths and my weaknesses. He saw where I failed. So for him to come to that belief that I'm the Son of God takes something truly incredible. Now I'll ask, what would it take for him to believe that I'm the Son of God and then die for those beliefs? It would take something truly incredible. I would say it would even take proof, absolute certainty that I was who I said I was, or in the case of James, that Jesus was who he said he was. So let's summarize these 4, let's say, well-supported historical facts. Number 1, Jesus existed and was crucified. Number 2, Jesus was buried and in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Number 3, Jesus' tomb was found empty. And finally, number 4, people firmly believed that Jesus was raised, even if they were predisposed to the contrary, and would die even for that fact. And I'll ask, what is the best explanation for these 4 historical facts? And I'll say even scholars believe, majority of scholars believe that these 4 facts are true. So even skeptics are met with this question: how do we explain this? I'll say there's been a number of different explanations over the years. Some believe that he was never killed by the Romans and crucified, but this is attested to clearly in history. Some believe that his body may have been left in a mass grave or lost, but we see that it was in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Some believe that that his brother or somebody just stole him out of the tomb. But we read that these people were dying for this fact. They wouldn't just die for what they knew was a lie. So what is the best explanation? I believe, and I challenge you to believe, that Jesus definitely rose from the dead. As it was said to the woman by the angels at the tomb, "Why do you seek the living with the dead? He is not here, he is risen." What does this mean to us? Well, entire sermons and series could be written on this and said about this, and we've been hearing about this in our series on hope. What does this mean to us, though? It shows that Jesus is, in fact, the Son of God, that a man truly is the Son of God. He came and lived and had a physical body. We also have assurance that all of his words are true, that he, in fact, does have the power to forgive sins, that he has the power to intercede for us, to provide for our needs, to judge in the end by his words, and to save in the end. He is truly in heaven, and he has truly prepared a place for his followers. And he is living, he is reigning, and he is returning. I want to point out another song that we'll sing in just a moment, Because He Lives, number 610 in the book. I want to read verse 2, which I've sang many times growing up, but it's hitting a little differently now. How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives. But greater still, the calm assurance this child can face uncertain days because he lives. Because he lives, we can have absolute assurance in this life and in the next. So what will you do with the evidence? I imagine many people today already believed in the resurrection. But I ask that you consider rededicating your life to him. This is more than just a story that you heard growing up. that Jesus was resurrected. This is based off of historical facts. This is real, just as real as your body is, as real as Jesus' hands were pierced and went into the tomb for 3 days, but then were risen. If you haven't already believed, the choice is yours. Please consider the evidence, and if you would like to discuss more with me about the evidence, I'd be glad to share some points that didn't make it in here. But the choice is yours. The evidence is yours. C.S. Lewis writes, "What are we to make of Christ? There is no question of what we can make of him. It is entirely a question what he will make of us. You must either accept or reject his story." So what will you do with the evidence? If you would like to become one of his followers, if you would like to become a Christian, you have the opportunity today. You can continue the discussion, but if you'd like to become a Christian now, please come to the front as we stand and sing.